So can you kind of just start off by explaining how executive orders work in general and how they're enforced?
Well, in terms of executive orders, that obviously the president is part of the executive branch. That's what the branch that he heads. And their job is to execute the laws, and basically laws that are passed by Congress and interpreted by the courts, particularly the U.S. Supreme Court, and especially if you're talking constitutional amendment of some sort, like you think free speech or something of that nature. But it's usually the Justice Department, but can be other departments as well that are involved in enforcing the various laws. So you think education department and, whatever it happens to be. And so an executive order can basically essentially say, this is how we're going to interpret and enforce some particular law that we have jurisdiction of dealing with. And so at least as far as that administration is concerned, that's how they're going to enforce it. And so that's why we get into the situation where when you have one president change over to another president, especially if it's a change in parties, they may have different views as to how certain laws may be enforced. And we're seeing that particularly with immigration laws, where the Biden administration, when it came in, it changed some things like the Remain in Mexico policy. And then now when the Trump administration has come back in, it's going to put those things back in place. So it's a sort of a political view of this. And again, it all has to be done within the parameters of the presidential powers, but executive orders is usually a big one, although people often fight about it. And certainly we're seeing that with and we'll see that with some of Trump's executive orders, where obviously liberal groups and Democrats don't like some of his policies that he's proposing and how he's going to approach these things, just like the Republicans didn't like some of Biden's policies. And so these can be challenged in court to see whether or not they're consistent with presidential powers.
Well, can you also give a quick overview of kind of how birthright citizenship worked kind of in a pre-Trump era?
Pre-Trump era. Well, let's start with the 14th Amendment, because that's, of course, what everybody's going to be talking about. And what the 14th Amendment, Section 1 says is that all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and the state wherein they reside. So that gives the notion that, well, if you're born in the United States, you must be a citizen regardless of the status of your parents. And by status of the parents, I mean whether they're here legally or not. And it could be even that they don't have to be citizens of the United States. They could be citizens of another country, but they're here like on a permanent basis of some sort. It could be on a visa, tourist, student, work, whatever it happens to be. So, I mean, there's some aspects to this that are entirely clear. Now, the U.S. Supreme Court in 1898, in a case by the name of United States versus Ark, I think was the last name, that basically it was a Chinese man who his parents were in the United States and they had been here for a long time, had businesses here, but they were still Chinese citizens. He went back to China and then was refused re-entry. And that was the case that went to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court basically said, well, your parents are here legally, and so you're going to be, and you were born here, so you are still considered a citizen. But that doesn't really address the situation that Trump is dealing with. Now, one other thing to this is that there's also federal legislation whose language mirrors what's in the 14th Amendment. So it still has that phrase that seems to qualify it, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof. And that's really what the question is at this point, is that even though for the last probably several decades at least, we've had this notion that, again, well, as the name suggests, birthright citizenship. You're born here, you're a citizen, and therefore you can stay, you have all the rights and privileges of any other citizen. And what that would often mean as a practical matter is that even if your parents were here illegally, they wouldn't necessarily be deported, because we obviously wouldn't want to deport parents and have the child stay here, kind of a thing, although I suppose that could happen if they stay with relatives or something like that. But that's a very tough argument to make for moral reasons, if nothing else. But that's sort of how it's been understood for a fairly long time. But again, given the situation that we're in right now, from the Trump administration's perspective, and given that illegal immigration was a big issue in the last campaign, that the idea is that Trump administration wants to do something about it. And this is what they're going to do, is to try to limit this, because they don't want to have what was phrased more or less like, birthright tourism, where people would come here, have a kid, born in the United States and then get to stay and maybe bring in other relatives as well. And that was just making the immigration problem even worse than it already was in a variety of ways. And so this is one way to sort of limit that. So if somebody does come here, but they're here illegally, even if a child is born here, they all potentially could be deported. And that person born here, the child, would not necessarily have the rights of a US citizen, and therefore make it easier to deport the whole family in that particular regard. I'll stop there. So I don't want to get too deep in the weeds unless you have more questions to sort of focus in a little bit.
Yeah. Well, in the executive order, it basically says that when I was reading through it, like the federal government can't issue citizens documents under certain, if the mother is not here legally or is here legally but doesn't have citizenship, and a lot of with the father. So under the text of Trump's executive order on birthright citizenship, can he enforce that? Or since it is in a constitutional amendment, is there a different process that has to play out for enforcing what he is wanting in that executive order?
Right. So let me back up just a little bit here. So again, the executive order is fairly specific about who this is going to apply to. So we need to think of, well, who doesn't it apply to? Well, even if the parents, if one or both of them is a citizen, then that child is going to be considered a citizen, whether it's the father or the mother. And usually we're thinking about the mother here. Excuse me, whether if she's here illegally, if the father's a citizen, then still the child would still have citizenship. So that's not particularly a problem. It's only a situation where both parents, if they're here in the United States, and of course only the mother would necessarily have to be here, the father could be still elsewhere. But if neither one of them is a citizen, and if neither one of them is here legally, and it's got to be something long-term, it can't be just like a tourist visa or something like that. And that had been something that had been happening too, where people would get a tourist visa and have their child in the United States, and then all of a sudden claim US citizenship and all of the, again, privileges and immunities that come from that. And that was not a huge problem, I suppose, but at least it was something that was causing problems for the immigration system. So in terms of how this works, it would simply be that as far as the federal government is concerned, that they are not going to issue citizenship papers to any child that's born in the United States if you have that situation where neither the father or the mother is a citizen, or they're not here on a long-term basis, kind of a thing. So again, you have to go back and look and say, well, that's a reinterpretation potentially of the 14th Amendment, at least how some people have interpreted recently. But it's not necessarily how the US Supreme Court has interpreted that portion of the amendment. And that's the question is, well, what does that 1898 case come in? How does that come into play? It's a little bit different situation. Again, that person's parents had been, even though they were Chinese citizens, that they had been in the United States for a long time on a permanent basis. And so that gave that child the ability to be a citizen when born in the United States. So that's a little different situation. But is that the limit, the extent of that? And that's the question. So of course, when you have people that have already challenged this in court, the ACLU and some states have apparently challenged it, that they are viewing the birthright citizenship, since we're phrasing it that way, much more expansively. You're born here, you're a citizen, end of story. But there's some question to it. In other words, how will the courts interpret that phrase, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof? Is that in fact a limiting factor that people really haven't been enforcing to this point, and which the Trump administration now wants to try to enforce by saying that, well, you're not really subject to the jurisdiction thereof if neither of your parents are citizens or they aren't here legally, kind of a thing. We don't know the answer to that. You'll certainly, if you talk to a variety of legal scholars, some will try to say definitively it's this, others will say no, it's that. We don't know. We're going to have to wait until this plays out in the courts, and potentially all the way up to the US Supreme Court, to see how they're going to interpret that particular phrase. And they'll look at not just maybe what the writers, the drafters of the 14th Amendment were thinking about. And again, they probably weren't thinking about immigration at that time. They were thinking more along the lines of slavery. So that may or may not be helpful. They'll look at what the Supreme Court did in that 1898 case. They'll look at the federal legislation that mirrors that language and how it's been interpreted in the past. And that is one of the things that courts will often look at, judges will look at, is how much reliance has there been on a particular interpretation. So this potentially could be quite different interpretation of the law. And even if it may be within the bounds of the law, sometimes judges are reluctant to enforce that when people have relied on it in a particular way. Of course, that reliance ends up creating a loophole, which of course Republicans, the Trump administration in particular, would like to close given the problems that we already have with immigration. So I suppose the short version is we'll see once the courts get a hold of it. And you can, at least at the district court level, you can probably find a judge that's more on the liberal side that would say, oh no, that the Trump administration can't enforce that. And so then it'll go to on appeal to a federal court of appeals. And then, as I said, ultimately, I suppose, to the US Supreme Court. And this is going to take some time.
Right. So what is that appeals process going to look like? I'm sorry, like the suits that those states filed, how is that going to play out? What can we kind of expect?
Well, again, there are a variety of things that can happen, and it's going to essentially play out the way we've seen some other things play out in terms of like Biden is issuing executive order to cancel student debt, that somebody challenges that, it goes to court. You know, a district court judge, which is the lowest level at the federal court system, will say, you know, one way or the other, then that'll get challenged by the losing party. And so it works its way up to the Supreme Court. So for this, it will happen is, again, that the ACLU is one of the parties bringing a suit, as I understand it, maybe some states as well. So they can probably find a district court judge that's, again, more on the liberal side that would say that the executive order violates the interpretation and meaning of the Constitution, Supreme Court's case, federal, you know, whatever it happens to be, and strike it down. So then the Trump administration would appeal to that Federal Circuit Court of Appeals. So if it's in, say, California, I'm not sure if California is one of the states, but it could be one of the states that decides to challenge it. So they would go to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and regardless of what the outcome there is, the losing party would undoubtedly file before the US Supreme Court. Now, the US Supreme Court right now is tending to the conservative side. You have three strong liberals, a couple of strong conservatives, and a couple of people that are conservative, but a little on the questionable side in terms of how they go. Roberts, Kavanaugh, Gorsuch, not, you know, necessarily guaranteed conservative votes. And so it depends then how they interpret this. And so again, that's where we're back to looking at sort of the history of this, both in terms of how the 14th Amendment was drafted, what the drafters of that were looking at, the Supreme Court case previously, the federal legislation, reliance on the law. And again, a lot of times judges don't like to make huge changes if people have relied on the law, a certain interpretation of the law, even if the new interpretation may be within the realm of possibility, they may be reluctant to make that change. So we really don't know, despite the fact that you're probably going to have various legal folks say, oh yes, it's got to be this or it's got to be that. We have to wait to see what the judges say.
For spelling that out. That helped put it into perspective a lot better. And so I guess one quick question before we head out. I was just kind of wondering, so, you know, I know that in the order it said it'll start taking effect next month, where they can't issue those citizenship paperwork. Since he has been sued, or those states have filed suit against that executive order, will he not be able to enforce that until it works through the court system, or will there be an immediate impact on people with that executive order? If that makes sense. I don't know if I phrased that super well, but kind of, can he start enforcing that next month, essentially?
The short answer would be yes, unless a judge blocks it, puts an injunction on it. And that's going to be, I'm sure, I haven't seen the paperwork, but I'm sure that's what the ACLU and anybody else that's challenging this would ask for. Is immediately they would say, we need to have an injunction to keep this from going into effect, because they got a month. And that's partly why you give people some time to adjust. Both as a practical matter, you need to do that to make sure everybody in the executive branch understands what it is that's going to be required of them under the new procedures, but also it gives time for any party to go ahead and challenge it. And so that's what's going to happen. And undoubtedly, they'll get a judge that will say, all right, we need to think about this, because it's, again, yes, some legal scholars may be certain that it's this way or that way, but you know, judges may be a little bit more cautious on this and say, well, we need to have the full argument on this. We need to bring in people that are talking about the historical nature of this. And some of these laws are quite old. And so let's just put a hold on this. In other words, ask for an injunction, a stay, to basically say, well, okay, keep the policy in place the way it is now until we can have time to have a full argument and a trial on this issue before going forward. And so again, it's very possible that you'll get some judge to issue an injunction to prevent the executive branch from enforcing this. But then the trial process will continue on, and the policy will, as it currently stands, will stay in place. Although, again, the executive branch can do things, as we've seen in other executive branches. They can drag their feet about how forcefully they enforce one thing or another. So, even if it's the idea of whether they're going to issue citizenship papers, they can take their time about it if they so choose. So you don't have to whip things through very quickly before the executive order is declared constitutional, if that happens. So we just sort of have to wait and see. But my guess is that the first thing that would happen would be to try to get an injunction to stop it from being enforced on the date that the administration wants.
I appreciate you spelling that out. And then I guess the last thing we had, is there anything that you wanted to add we didn't ask about that you feel like is important when discussing the story and discussing this topic?
I just emphasize again that, you'll see different people saying that it's this, it's that. And certainly our understanding, just because of the name birthright citizenship, gives the impression that automatically you're a citizen if you're born here. But this has been something that people have been questioning, some people at least have been questioning for some time, as to whether that's really an appropriate interpretation. And again, mainly because of that phrase, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof. What exactly does that mean? We haven't gotten a lot of cases where judges, particularly the US Supreme Court, have weighed in on that, because it hasn't been a particular issue. And as much as immigration has been an issue for 3-4 decades, at least since back in the Reagan years, when we had the big amnesty and things of that nature, this is sort of a greater emphasis on it, because that was part of Trump's campaign. And so as a result, now we're going to focus on this, mainly because of that executive order. And even if the Trump administration loses, at least we'll have a definitive answer from potentially the Supreme Court as to what that phrase means. And then maybe if the idea of this birthright tourism is still a problem, that they can find some other way to deal with it, to prevent people from just coming here, having a kid, and then all of a sudden that child is automatically considered a citizen. And again, all of the I hate to say problems, but all of the issues that are resulting from that.
All right.
Thank you
Well,
very much.
yeah, well, thank you so much for your time. It was great talking to you.
Sure,
Yeah, and have a
welcome.
blast.